one other argument that Cigar talks about that, you know, is, I think, somewhat similar to Williams, but he kind of treats it as the same as Williams, that it's not, is Scheffler's. So I don't want to talk about Scheffler's argument because I think it's importantly different than Williams, and it's another argument that immortality would be bad. I think it's worth considering. We're going to see, it's also interesting. Other philosophers like Heidegger and maybe Hegel have made arguments like this, but I think Scheffler's is clearer. Theirs are different. They're in the same ballpark. They're harder to pin down. Scheffler's is easier to say what he's actually saying than those guys. Hegel, Heidegger, if you ever take any future philosophy classes, those guys are notoriously hard to pin down what they're actually saying. Okay. So what's Scheffler's argument? So Scheffler does not think, like Williams, that immortality would necessarily be boring. But he thinks that immortality would be bad for us because it would in some way make us incapable of valuing things. He thinks the consciousness of death, or the possibility of death, is at least in some way necessary for finding value in anything. Well, how is that, though? So one thing Scheffler says, and Cigar talks about this, is that Scheffler says, well, human choices are made with the consciousness of limited time. He sometimes talks about death being the backdrop against which these decisions are made. He says, that would change if we were immortal. They would not really be human choices anymore. Now, I'm not sure, Cigar acts like this is a fairly convincing argument. I don't find it such, honestly. I mean, is it even true, right? How often does a consciousness of death figure into your choices? When you make choices, even pretty big ones, like to go to college or, something like that, do you think of death? Are you like, well, I'm going to die eventually, so, college is a good use of my limited time. I would imagine that any sort of explicit consciousness awareness of death, even when you make big, important choices in life, I'm going to guess it's pretty rare. When I was younger, it was even rarer, right? The idea of death was this abstract possibility. As I've gotten older, I think about it more, but, I don't know that it's always there when I make a big choice, or that it's necessary for a big choice to be a proper choice. It just doesn't seem right to me. What is this awareness you're talking about, Scheffler? What does it look like? I just don't, on the most common sense ways, I just don't see that it's there, right? Maybe it is for Scheffler, maybe it's different than for you. But when I make choices, even very important ones, right? I don't think Scheffler even would say that when you choose to get a chili dog for lunch instead of a salad, you're thinking, you have to think of death, right? Maybe if you have too many chili dogs, you should be, but whatever. But, he says, for big choices to be meaningful in the way that they're supposed to be, he thinks you have to have some consciousness of death. Or he seems to think that, and I just don't see that, right? I think of the big choices I've made throughout my life, even recently, and any kind of consciousness of death, a lot of times hasn't figured into them, right? I guess you could argue that if we were aware of our mortality, our choices would be more authentic or better or something, some way. Heidegger, who I mentioned, makes that kind of argument. That doesn't seem like it's Scheffler's argument, though. And even if that's true, even if mortality, a consciousness of the fact we're going to die, is necessary for human choices, well, if that changed, would it be a bad thing, right? They're different. They're no longer human choices. I think a lot of people who want immortality wouldn't care about that, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have these people who call themselves transhumanists. They want to transcend the human mortal body, download their mind to a computer or something. I think they'd just shrug and say, who cares, Scheffler, right? Yeah, it wouldn't be a human choice. I've always known that. What's so important about it being a human choice? What's being lost if it's not a human choice anymore, right? If you download your consciousness to a computer, you can't sweat anymore either. So maybe, if you exercise, it's not human exercise, but well, who cares? And, like a lot of people who are religious want immortality. And I mean, a part of this is that the afterlife is not going to be like the current one, right? Christianity, Islam, very insistent on an afterlife. And the idea is, people will be resurrected. But when they're resurrected, they'll be different than they were before. Judaism is less insistent on the afterlife. Christianity and Islam are a lot closer on this one. The afterlife doesn't play as big a role, but even Judaism, the forms that do talk about an afterlife, that put more emphasis on it, it'll be different, right? And they would say, okay, Scheffler, we knew that, who cares? Won't be a human choice as we're familiar with it, it'll be different. You got to show me that different is bad, and you don't do that. So that's the way Cigar presents Scheffler's argument, and as he presents it, it doesn't seem super convincing to me. And to be fair, if you actually read Scheffler's piece, he doesn't do a much better job himself. You kind of have to go digging in some of his other work to rebuild his argument. But I think when you rebuild his argument, it's something like this. Valuing something requires that we have certain emotional vulnerabilities. If you care about something, you're anxious or afraid of failure, right? You're hopeful for success. You are really happy if it does succeed. You are frustrated at challenges, right? If you value your education, you might be anxious about a big test. You are afraid of getting an F. You are frustrated when you just don't get something. You are happy when that test you were afraid of or anxious about comes back with an A on it, right? Or you're sad if it doesn't come back with an A on it. You have all kinds of emotional vulnerabilities because you value your education. If you value, being good at something like, you want to do really well in a race, you might be nervous about not doing as well as you want to, you might be frustrated if you're not improving, you might be really happy, you will be really happy if you succeed, you get the time you want. You're probably going to be disappointed, frustrated if you don't, right? Part of valuing something is to have these emotional vulnerabilities. So says Scheffler. Well, Scheffler says, look, immortal beings would lose these emotional vulnerabilities. And if they would, that would mean they can't really value anything, right? If you get an A back and you're like, meh. If your reaction to getting an A back on your test is the same as if you got an F, obviously you don't value education, right? If you're not happy with the A, if you're not disappointed with the F, if you just kind of shrug, you don't value it, right? If you sign up for something like a race and you just don't care how you do, you don't really value it, right? If you don't have these emotional vulnerabilities, anxiety, fear of failure, frustration at challenges, happy, hopeful for success, if you don't have those kinds of feelings, Scheffler would say you do not value the thing in question. These are necessary for valuing it. Well, immortal beings would lose those emotional vulnerabilities. Well, why does Scheffler think that? Well, Scheffler thinks that because he kind of thinks that, two things. One is just, these are two very closely related, right? One is just things no longer have any stakes, right? If you fail now, you have an infinite amount of time to do it in the future. You get an F now, you can retake the class 1,000,000 times because you're going to live forever, right? You don't get the time you want in a race, well, whatever. You can do it next year or the year after, the year after, the year after, the year after, right? Even big relationships, right? If you're married and your current marriage fails, well, if you're immortal, you know that maybe the next one will be okay, or the next 30, right? Heck, you might even think with a marriage, well, none of them are going to last forever. If you live long enough, who cares, right? Same with other relationships. Who cares? If these friendships go away, well, of course they're going to. If we live long enough, I can always make more later, right? Because there's no stakes, you wouldn't have these emotional vulnerabilities. No stakes because you have infinite amount of time. And very closely related, nothing could ever really threaten you, right? Life would be like playing a video game on super easy mode, right? Or playing chess, if you're pretty good at it, with somebody who just learned to play, right? Think about that. That's not fun, right? If you can't get killed in a video game that's fun for a little bit, it's not fun after a while. It gets boring, but even if it's not boring, it just doesn't mean anything to win at the levels, right? If you beat somebody in chess who just started playing, who barely knows how the pieces move, well, whoop-de-doo, right? So Scheffler would say, for the same reason, any sort of accomplishments, because they would be easy, because you have infinite time, they lose any sort of real meaning, right? You're not vulnerable because you have infinite time, there's no real loss. Also, because you have infinite time, success means nothing. So immortal beings could not really value anything. Now, I think there are two ways to challenge Scheffler's argument. I think it's an interesting argument, like Williams. There's something to it. It's interesting, maybe there is something, maybe it does show that mortality, the fact that we're going to die, plays some role in giving meaning to our lives. But there are two aspects I would push back on. I would push back on both 1 and 2. Premise 1, well, you get into some really complicated issues in what value is in a field that philosophers call metaethics. There's a bad old philosopher joke that meta means really hard and confusing. It doesn't, but generally metaethics, metaphysics, anything in those fields gets really confusing, really abstract really quickly. Suffice it to say, it's not 100% clear Scheffler's right that this is what valuing is. Some philosophers disagree with him, and there are certain religious traditions. There's an interesting paper by this guy, Carey, Dispassion as an Ethical Ideal, where he talks about them. A lot of religious traditions say that properly valuing something doesn't involve these emotional vulnerabilities. Stoicism, I think, says this. A lot of schools of Christian mysticism say it. I'm a little more worried that I'm just talking out of my well, when I get further into other traditions, but I think this is something Taoism and Buddhism would say, that proper valuing doesn't involve these emotional vulnerabilities. So there's room to doubt one, but that gets into some pretty deep water pretty quickly. So I'm going to kind of set that aside. You get into metaethics and you get into a lot of issues in the history of philosophy and religion that I'm probably not super competent to talk about, and also I think we just get lost. But I think there's also a worry about two. I mean, Scheffler seems, there's a good case he makes. Well, wouldn't you lose these vulnerabilities? Seems like you would, but I don't know. I think the same issue here is the one that kind of dogs Williams' argument. And that is, how confident could you be about how you would react to this unfamiliar situation? Would you really lose these vulnerabilities? I don't know. I am really not sure. Even back in the day when I knew I had plenty of time to get better at chess and to play more games, I still hated to lose, right? Not clear to me that, just because you say, well, I have infinite time, I can play infinite games, would it really be the case that, you make some stupid move and your friend beats you, you're going to be like, infinite time, infinite games, who cares, right? Or if you were immortal and you knew you would have like endless relationships, if your marriage of 50 years just blew up on you, would you really be so completely calm and say, meh, who cares? I'll have another 50 marriages. Meh, whatever. I don't know, right? I mean, look, this is so unfamiliar, so far off our actual situations. I think Scheffler can tell a good, fairly convincing story about why we would lose these emotional vulnerabilities, why accomplishment would cease to mean anything for us. I'm just not sure that how much we should take from the fact he can tell a good story about that. Does that prove that that's what it would be like? On that point, I at least am a little bit more skeptical. So I think the same problem that Williams' argument has, or the same worry, also is a worry that Scheffler's argument faces, even though they're slightly different arguments. All right, so that's really, we'll talk about the Borges piece, The Immortal. He picks up some of these themes. Some of the themes in Williams, but I think he really kind of likes these Scheffler ideas. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about The Immortal, see what we think about it. But as far as lectures go, I have reached the end of the cheery, wonderful subject of death to start our class with, right? That's all me being ironic. All right, so that is it for this unit, except for our discussion on the Borges piece. I am, looking forward to talking to you guys about Borges. Interesting story. Borges is a great writer. If you've not read him before, I hope you enjoy it. I quite enjoy many of his works. He also seems to be both fascinated and repelled by this idea of infinity. Just generally, he takes it up in some other stories that we're not going to read. So I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. All right. Anyway, that's the end for the unit on death, or at least the lectures on the philosophical issues around death.